What if you created a digital legacy that outlives you? Welcome this morning to the Design Your Legacy podcast. My name is Angelina Carleton, and I'm the hostess. And I look to distill the best practices, positive examples in action, and the best ideas to inspire you. As today's affluent are two-thirds self-made, I hope to invite a variety of guests from many walks of life and income levels to bring you their insights and experiences. I hope to provide interesting guests again who challenge your beliefs with their strong bias towards optimism and how you too can value your life, time, and personal legacy. This morning, I have the privilege to introduce you to John Follis. He is a former Madison Avenue ad man and an award-winning writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, as well as Forbes. He's worked with the Marriott Marquis in New York City, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, as well as Dunkin' Donuts. He's had one of the most awarded ad agencies on Madison Avenue. He's had the Harvard School review some of his work in their business case studies, and he's addressed the Yale Entrepreneurship Institute. And least of all, not to mention, he's also been honored by the White House and the United Nations. Welcome, John.
Oh, thank you, Angelina. Pleasure to be here.
So, did I miss anything in your background before we dive
No,
into?
you covered most of it.
Okay, wonderful. So, what was the most exciting experience from your ad days before we jump into how to create a digital legacy and what you've done?
Yeah, sure. Well, you mentioned it. It's not often one would get invited to the White House unless you know someone personally there or you're a member of the cabinet or government, especially if you're in the advertising business. I don't think there are many ad guys that get invited to the White House. So when I received a letter in the mail when I had my New York agency and I noticed that the return address on it was the White House, I thought it was a joke. I thought, boy, someone is trying to get my attention and they've done a pretty good job, until I opened it and it was actually a real invitation from the White House to be honored. And the reason for that was this was in the early 90s. We had recently done a national TV campaign working with the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse. And they did a deal with the NBA where the NBA allowed the TV commercials that we created to be aired during their playoff games that year. So these commercials ran like crazy for about a month or 6 weeks, multiple times during NBA playoff games. So they were seen by anyone who was watching basketball that year. Now, to this day, Angelina, I still don't know exactly how I got invited, but obviously someone involved with the White House, could have even been the president, was watching the basketball playoffs and noticed these TV spots. And because this is during Bush 1, and Barbara Bush, one of her pet projects was child abuse prevention. So I think someone, maybe George, was watching the games and saw these child abuse commercials. And the commercials we did were very creative. They really stood out. So for whatever reason, someone noticed them. And next thing I knew, I was one of many people. This is when they were doing the 1,000 points of light and trying to acknowledge and honor many people around the country who were doing cause-related things and making the country better, through their voluntary efforts. So I was one of a couple of dozen people to be invited, but certainly it was quite a thrill, as you can imagine, to be invited and honored at the White House and get a photo op with the First Lady and all that. So that by far was, I would say, the most exciting experience I had during my ad career.
Yeah, and you also had a heart, not just for the cause that you worked on related to child abuse, but also an anti-bullying campaign.
Oh yeah, throughout, the advertising business can be very superficial, right? You are, if you're working for an agency, you're stuck working on the accounts that they have. So you're spending your life selling Pop-Tarts or fish sticks or car batteries. And sometimes products that aren't that healthy, to be honest with you, soda or, fast food and stuff like that. So I made it a point throughout my career and started very early on in my career to find various public service causes that I wanted to volunteer my time to helping. And during the course of my career, I probably worked on close to 36 different public service causes. And one of them you just mentioned was anti-bullying. So that's just one of several dozen, causes that I've devoted my time and energy to.
Yes, and you've also had some exciting moments that you cover in your series, and I'll make sure that I include a link in the show notes, where you also raised your hand at one moment when you were at an event to question the CEO, but we'll get into that in a moment.
Okay.
So we'll leave the listeners and the viewers at the edge of their seats. So I'm going to change gears for a moment. What are two of the biggest problems, though, that you see facing business owners and entrepreneurs today?
Well, from a marketing standpoint, those issues are that they all need marketing help, but it's very difficult for them to figure out how to address that. Many of them, especially smaller businesses and entrepreneurs, try to do it themselves. And even if they have pretty good marketing instincts, it's a very difficult prospect to try to market yourself, mainly because it takes a certain level of objectivity to really know what you need to do and how your business is perceived. Because it's their business, they don't have the objectivity that they really need to look at their business from the outside. And for that reason, they start going down paths and spend a lot of time and energy going down a path that's a totally wrong path to go down to, simply because they don't have the perspective that they need. So that's one of the biggest things. And the other challenge for them is, even if they know that they need to get some outside marketing help, it's very hard to find the right help, because a lot of marketing people tend to be good salespeople. They're good at selling themselves. They're fast talkers. They're pretty good at selling, not so good at the doing part. So they can be easily swayed by someone who gives a good pitch for their business or service, and may not be so good at actually providing that service to them. So it's a very challenging thing to address their marketing.
Yes, I know that you've shared that sometimes individuals within the advertising industry are very niched compared to having a big picture or a big idea type of mindset to cover all the bases, again, to be able to deliver to the client, to the customer and that's the perspective that needs to be acknowledged.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is, sometimes you would think a business owner would be really clear on who their target audience is, and I found after I had my agency, as you may or may not know, Angelina, I pretty quickly realized, this was in the late 90s. I mean, I'm 67, so I've been doing this a long time, but my agency was in the 90s, and as the internet became the dominant choice for especially smaller businesses to begin interfacing with their prospects, it became a lot less about advertising, certainly traditional advertising, and more about marketing and digital marketing. So that's when I rebranded myself and started doing consulting for smaller businesses. I called myself a marketing therapist, because so many business owners, I found that it was kind of a combination of therapy and marketing that they really needed. But as a result, I worked with dozens of smaller businesses around the country. And this was, pretty early on that I was doing this, where I was interfacing via the internet in the early 2000s. But as a result, I really got the experience of working with a lot of small business owners. And it was surprising to find that many of them were not as clear as I thought they needed to be about who their target audience is. And if you're not really clear about that, you really can't begin to address the marketing,
And
because your
craft the
marketing has to
message.
be specifically targeted to who you're talking to.
Yes, yes. So in addition to the problem that they're not seeing their business objectively, then do you see that the second problem is that they're not asking for the right help?
Well, no, the second problem is it's hard for them to determine who the right help is, because like I
Ah,
said, there's so many marketing services out there, and these business owners, their heads are spinning. Do I need to work with this guy? Do I need to work with a guy who knows AdWords, then AdSense, Google Analytics? Do I need to have a more general guy who's more strategically focused? Do I need to talk to someone who's a specialist on branding? Do I need, it's a very, there's so many flavors of marketing. Marketing is a very big and broad umbrella. And like I said, a lot of these marketing people are very good at selling what they're doing and pitching their services, and sometimes not so good at really addressing the needs of that particular business owner.
yeah, and cutting through all that noise to reach the customer. Absolutely. I've had individuals ask me, who's good? How do we find who's good? And the answer always ends up being word of mouth, referrals.
Right.
Yeah. Well, most of the time, sometimes I think maybe there can be a sales funnel that can, really work and convert, but most of the time it's through word of mouth of who do you trust. Okay. So you
Right.
created a digital series called True Stories in Advertising. As I mentioned, I will include that in the show notes or the description. And you created this to overcome perceptions around advertising in creating effective campaigns. So we all know advertising doesn't always present the truth in an ethical way, but possibly the best light. So what do you have to say about this, given your career experiences? Because I think this also can shine a light on it, one of the, what I call like one of the pink elephants in the room.
Yeah. So I one of my talents is creating digital video content. And I'm also a writer. So throughout my career, I started writing down a lot of my advertising experiences. And in 2015, I decided to take some of these essays that I had written, some of these stories, and try to, because these days, even in 2015, but especially now, Angelina, people just don't take a lot of time to read stuff. Everything is, as you said, their attention spans is very quick. So
It's less than a goldfish.
right. So if they have the option of clicking on a video or reading something, they're going to click on the video. And because I was good at creating video content, I decided to take some of these stories that I'd written and convert them to digital video. I titled it True Stories in Advertising. And it's not so much to overcome perceptions about the advertising business, although that may be part of it. It's really just to share some of the stories that I experienced, some of the experiences that I had in business, working in the industry for 30 plus years.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt you for a moment. So, and this makes you very human. So you got fired 4 times in 7 years, but that
Right.
didn't stop you in your determination. So I think for anyone who's listening that thinks, oh, well, I stumbled once or twice or 3 times, I should just give up. But you did not give up.
Well, that was certainly one of the experiences that I thought would make a good story to tell, right?
Yes. And how you
Because
confronted the CEO, but I'll let you tell it.
it's, yeah, I mean, there's so far, I don't know if I'm going to make any more, but I've done 9 of these stories. And they all talk about a certain, what I think is an interesting story to tell. And one of them that you just brought up was how I got fired 4 times. And it wasn't just 4 times, it's 4 times in 7 years. So, getting 4 times is a lot, but then you add in 7 years, and it's the kind of thing that could really discourage anyone from wanting to continue, because you think, maybe I'm not suited for this career. And I'd be lying if I said that wasn't how I felt, after that 4th time. But I felt that it had less to do with my talent than the fact that maybe I just was not a good fit for the corporate world. And I realized after getting fired the first couple of times that it wasn't as much about talent as I thought it would be, that a big part of succeeding in that environment was how good you are at corporate politics. And I sucked at it.
I think a lot
So,
of people do. You're not the
yeah,
only one.
right. And so that was kind of an awakening that I was not prepared for, nor did I. They don't teach that stuff in college, right? They don't teach you how to deal with corporate politics. Maybe they should. So after getting fired the third and then the fourth time, I started to think that maybe I needed to pivot, not necessarily walk away from my career, because I was still convinced that I had talent, but that my talent wasn't really being realized in that environment. So I think it was maybe after the second or third time, Angelina, that I began on the side freelancing, doing project work that I was still able to do in addition to my staff job. And once got more involved with it after the third time I got fired. And then after the fourth time I got fired, I said, you know something, I'm not even going to try to get another staff job. Because at the time I had a couple of things in motion, projects in motion with freelance. And I said, I'm just going to put all my energy into this kind of more entrepreneurial freelance project work and see where it takes me. And that pivot turned out to be what enabled me to really have the success that I've had in my career.
Yes, yes. And I know one of the things you've also confronted in your true stories in advertising is the ethical issues that come up. So not just the politics, but the ethical issues.
Right.
And I think that that would be lovely if you would share it right now, given that I think many of the young adults under age 40, they face these ethical issues and they're not sure, what do I do? Who else has
Right.
faced this? How do they handle it? Because again, a lot of these nuances when it comes to what I call playground politics was not covered in private or public schools. No one gave you the white paper, the memo, the cliff
Right.
notes. Yes.
Yeah. Again, with my advertising, I went to a very good school for advertising, Syracuse
Syracuse.
University. And, maybe it would be a consideration for them to introduce a course that deals with ethics, not only in advertising, but in business, because whether you're in advertising or any business, there are going to be situations where you're going to have to make ethical choices, right? But it's certainly true in the advertising business. And I know a lot of people would not think twice about selling fast food or
Something
soda.
unhealthy.
So what's that?
Something unhealthy.
Yeah. Soda or cigarettes when cigarettes were legal to advertise. And then there are other people like me who are not so comfortable in using my talent toward getting more and more people to use a product that I think is not healthy for them. So you're talking about an experience I had when I worked at a big agency. This was in Chicago, and every year the CEO would have this big event where he would basically invite the entire staff to their huge auditorium and screen the agency reel of commercials. And as I think back on it, I think I was dating a kind of a hippie chick who was really ahead of her time in that she was very conscious about health food and good diet. And we're talking now in the 80s. This was actually about year was about 1979 or so. So I remember having a conversation with her around this time about refined sugar, and I didn't even know what refined sugar was. So for anyone to be like aware of the health concerns around refined sugar in 1979 was way ahead of their time. But she was like saying, John, come on, don't you know that's really bad? That's what that white sugar is, and that stuff is really unhealthy for you, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, I think aspartame is something like wood alcohol.
Right. So I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for this experience where I'm invited at this big agency to this big event with basically the entire staff, which is about 1,000+ people in this huge auditorium. And he screens the entire reel. And it's basically the whole idea of it is to say, aren't we great? Don't we do great work? And basically for everyone to pat the CEO on the back and say, you're doing such a great job. These commercials are awesome, blah, blah, blah. But he did, after showing 10 minutes of these commercials, which included, we had all kinds of clients. One of them was Kraft. And Kraft, whatever Kraft makes, they make a ton of products. But one of the products they made was marshmallows. So he showed this commercial with marshmallows. It featured a family with a mom and their kids and puppy dogs, and just this warm and fuzzy thing around marshmallows makes your life complete. And at the end of it, he opened it up to the audience for questions. And he was getting a lot of questions that I thought were pretty lame. Nothing that I thought was like really thought provoking. So again, this was right shortly after I had this conversation with this girlfriend about refined sugar. And it just, looking back, I was pretty naive, because again, it wasn't the smartest thing to basically ask the question that I asked to the CEO in front of the staff of the entire agency. But I raised my hand.
I think you meant well.
What's that?
I think you meant well.
Well, I think I was wrestling with the fact that I was working for an agency that was advertising products that may not be so healthy. And I was seriously curious how the CEO felt about that, And so it really wasn't intended to be antagonistic. It was simply a matter of, how does he feel? So I'll just say the question. I said, I said, regarding that Kraft marshmallow spot that you just showed, how do you feel as CEO of this agency to be advertising a product like marshmallows that's probably 100% refined sugar with zero nutritional value, and targeting mothers and their little kids with your commercials? And a hush fell over. You could hear a pin drop at that moment. And I just watched as 1,000 faces just turned and looked at me and just gave me the strangest look. And the CEO was like, it was like someone hit him upside the head with a brick, because he was not expecting a question like that. He had been answering questions that were just really, simple softballs that were being tossed. And his answer was, as CEO of this agency, I do not believe that it is our job or our responsibility to determine what we should or shouldn't be advertising. It is our job as an agency to work with the clients that want to hire us as an agency and do the very best job possible to promote their products and services. And 4 months later, I was fired.
Yeah, I think where you're pointing the flashlight is when individuals in the advertising industry get paid large sums of money, where does ethics come in, if at all? And especially back then, if there wasn't that transparency like there is a little bit more today regarding, all the stuff that's on the internet and people just talking about ingredients and the rise of diabetes. And yeah. So
now, as you know, Angelina, there's a second part to the story.
yes, I know.
which I tell you, I could not make this stuff up, right? I got fired a few months later. They didn't say it was because you asked that question 4 months ago, but I have no doubt that was a big part of it. So fast forward 13 years. I'm now in New York,
Doing really well.
the head of my own award-winning Madison Avenue agency with my name first on the door of the agency. And we are now working with an organization called the Advertising Association, the 4As, the Advertising Association of Ad Agencies, which is kind of a governing body for all the agencies in the world. And they are looking for new members to join their organization because they provide services to agencies. And we are now the hot young agency on Madison Avenue. So I'm up at their headquarters in New York City. And the guy who's talking to me is like the membership director, says, John, you guys have done an amazing job with your agency, but, I don't know anything about your background or anything. He said, where did you work before you started your agency? Because I know nothing about you. So I mentioned the agency in Chicago that I used to work at, got fired from, to which he replies, you're kidding me. Do you know that John O'Toole, the president of our organization, used to be the CEO of that agency? And I said, yes, I do know that. He said, as a matter of fact, his office is right down the hall. I'm sure he would love to talk to you. Do you know him? And I said, well, I sort of know him. Come on, follow me. So he drags me into the office. And now this is the same CEO to whom I asked that question 13 years prior. Now, I certainly know who he is. He's not going to have any idea who I was. I was just a face in a crowd of 1,000 people asking a question. So he's not going to know me. So he drags me to the office. I'm introduced as the guy who used to work at his agency 13 years ago. He has no clue about me, but he does invite me to lunch. He said, listen, I'd love to talk to you some more. I'm busy right now, but let's have lunch. He invites me to the Four Seasons, which is one of the fanciest restaurants in New York City, the Four Seasons. So a couple weeks later, I'm sitting with him one-on-one, trying to decide whether or not I should bring up this situation that happened 13 years ago. And I tell myself, well, I'm certainly not going to do it before the check comes because our lunch is costing about $120. And this is,
Yes.
Yeah, and this is it. This is in 1990. But he's invited me. This is 4As. I have no doubt he's going to pick up the check. I'm certainly not going to want to pay for it. But after the check comes and we're drinking our coffee, I finally decide what the hell, what's he going to do to me? He can't fire me now. He's trying to get me to join his organization. So I said, listen, I said, before we leave, I'm just going to mention this. I said, I'm sure you don't remember this. And I go through the whole story. And he just looks at me and his reaction was really a bit unexpected. He said, well, first of all, he said, it took a lot of balls for you to ask that question. He said, wow, I'm impressed that you asked that. And then he said, and I said, well, so what did I answer? And I told him word for word, because I remembered it almost, verbatim what he answered. And he just looked at me. And I was really surprised at his response. He said, John, he said, I would not answer it the same way now. He said, thinking about it, I absolutely do believe that as business owners, especially of a large agency, we do have to take more corporate responsibility for the clients that we work with and the products we sell. So, good for you for asking that question back then. I think you were kind of ahead of your time, and I absolutely feel differently right now. So listen, it's been an honor meeting you and having lunch with you and having this conversation. And I do hope you join the 4As because we would love to have you as a member. And 8 months later, he died. I read in Ad Age that he died of leukemia. So just to have that opportunity to kind of come full circle with that CEO was again, a story that I could not have made up. It was just amazing.
Yeah, and I think where you're pointing the flashlight again is you held tight to your values, thinking that maybe you shouldn't have said it, maybe you shouldn't have done it. And yet at the end, perhaps the universe was testing you and it did work out for you. It just tested your mettle along the way.
I really felt vindicated. I didn't expect it. And again, the odds of that happening were just unbelievable. So this is why I decided to do these stories, because it's stories like that that I read on multiple levels that I think are worth telling.
Yes, number one, it's not the end of the world. Number two, trust your instincts. Number three, it doesn't hurt to have values and morals, even if
Right,
no one else in the room does. It's very easy to go along with the crowd. It's very difficult to be that, like you had spoken about, like that one hand that gets raised in the moment at the luncheon,
right,
and it wasn't your intention to publicly embarrass him. And yet the others interpreted that. And as you had said, he didn't even remember. And yet when
right.
he looked back, it became a learning moment for him.
Yeah, I mean, it was karmic vindication. And again, that lunch and having that conversation and hearing his words saying, John, it was very courageous of you to ask that question, and I would answer it very differently today. Thank you for sharing that story. Was an amazing experience. I would say in many ways it was even better than the experience of getting the honor at the White House, because just of the vindication of sticking to my values, and then 13 years later having that opportunity was pretty amazing.
Yeah. So to inspire any of the listeners or the viewers out there, this story, I think just goes to show that when you get your mettle tested, your METTLE, your mettle tested, that don't give up on yourself, because perhaps you might not be cut out for the corporate environment, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to make for a great business owner. Yes. Okay, so that's a wonderful story in looking in the rearview mirror. So looking forward, what would you say is the most effective way for a business owner today to market their business or themselves, given the landscape in 2022?
Well, every business is different, so I can't say to everyone listening what's the perfect solution for their business. It When I was doing my marketing consulting to businesses, I would minimally spend 2 hours interviewing them and asking questions about the business. So I knew every nuance about their business, and we made sure that we were speaking to the correct audience, and I knew all the benefits of their product or service. So then I could start to begin to figure out what marketing channels they have to use. But the short answer of the question is you have to obviously be cost effective about what you do.
Yes.
So you have to take advantage of all the low cost or free media channels, which are social media. And so much of social media is essentially free. So
Well,
obviously
because others are tracking the data, but go ahead.
what's that?
Because others are tracking the data, but
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, right. I guess that's the cost of using those platforms.
using their platforms. Yeah.
Yeah, but obviously you have to take advantage of all the social media. But again, the question is, who is your target audience? If your target audience is white guys over 60, you probably don't need to be on TikTok. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. So I think
Now,
one. Go
so
ahead.
again, it's where is your audience? Where's your on what platforms is the decision maker that you're trying to reach spending their time? And then you've got to figure out, once you know the media channels, then the question is okay, what do you say? What
And
is your message?
yeah, I just wanted to highlight for a moment that even though advertising has changed from the 1990s to today regarding uh, the use of digital media, today, one of the things that has not changed is getting the right message to the right prospect on an emotional level.
That's right. And you just said it. I think a lot of business owners and marketers make the mistake of thinking that once I know who I'm talking to, and once I figure out the media channel to use, I just have to put out my information out there. And that's all I have to do. And what they don't realize is that you're dealing with human beings. And just because you put your information out there and you think your information is awesome because this is your product and your service, and all you got to do is put the information about that, and they're going to jump, they're going to be excited about it. That's not how it works. If that information and that message is not presented in an engaging way, and when I say engaging, I mean on an emotional level, right? You're dealing with human beings, and that message needs to touch them and engage them on an emotional level. Not just an intellectual, but an emotional level, because if it doesn't, they're not going to respond to it. Yes. So in that sense, even though the media landscape in 2022 is very different than it was when I was active in the industry, in that sense, it hasn't changed. You're always going to be dealing with human beings that need to have the message, talk to them on an emotional level. You got to get them excited. That was my mantra when I had my agency, is you have to excite them and figure out what's going to excite them. Because if they're not excited, they're not going to respond.
Yeah, and you've got about 10 seconds you've shared with me.
Pardon me?
And you have about 10 seconds to grab their attention.
Well, whatever, this is why you and I were talking about how to introduce me in this podcast, whether it's a podcast, a TV commercial, a TikTok video, an Instagram post with video, anything, you've got to grab their attention in a positive way in the first, not just 10 seconds, really 5 seconds, because people's attention spans are short and getting shorter by the day. And if you don't grab them quickly, they're not going to stick around. With this podcast, in the first 10 seconds, would they listen to it? If you don't introduce me and say something that's going to be interesting to them, that's going to intrigue them, they're not going to stick around for the next 45 minutes.
Yes, yes. So speaking of podcasts, this being a legacy podcast, what would you like your legacy to be? Is it the true stories in advertising, or what say you?
Yeah, well, I as you know, I've shared with you, Angelina, I don't have a family. I don't have kids. So it's a little bit different for me than it might be for a lot of your listeners. If I had a family, it would be very different. I'd want them to know a lot about me. I mean, I do have a couple of nephews and a niece. But for me, it's more about, I think that because of the stories that I've shared with you, I think there are lessons to be learned from my experiences, not just about advertising, but just about business in general. So, for many of your listeners who may be entrepreneurs or just dealing with business issues, I think a lot of the stories that I share in True Stories might enlighten them in some way, just about dealing with business situations.
Yes, and I think that real world experience is priceless. It's gold to the young entrepreneur coming up, or even the middle-aged entrepreneur that's saying, how do I figure out this landscape? I have found myself with playground politics that I don't have the memo or cliff notes for. And I think you're being willing to distill your lessons into not just, let's say, a hardcover coffee table book, but a digital format that, like you mentioned, will outlive you, is a gift.
And it's also, listen, every business owner is really focusing on how they can market their business. They're always looking to get insights about how they can do that better, because that's the lifeblood of their business, is how well, there are a lot of businesses that have mediocre products, but they're kick-ass about how they market them. So
Yeah, I just want
any
to intrude for a second.
yeah,
Yeah, I learned that McDonald's didn't have the best hamburger. They just had the best marketing for their hamburger.
right.
Yeah,
So that's my point. So by sharing some of my stories that deal with marketing and advertising, they could also, I think, pick up some really interesting insights about marketing and advertising that may apply and help their marketing issues as well.
absolutely. Bravo. So, what personal values do you think got honored in your career or that you get to honor today with your true stories and advertising videos?
Sorry, what's the question?
What personal values do you think that you've honored in your career? Like the value of honesty, the value
Yeah,
of
I think for me, yeah, honesty has always been a big one, which is, very difficult in a industry like advertising. In many ways, I feel like I was kind of a misfit. I think when we chatted last week, Angelina, I think you made a comment, gee, you don't come off like an egotistical guy.
well, because like the Madman, this series on television, or this idea one has regarding what an ad executive is going to be like from Madison
Exactly.
Avenue.
And that's my point. In any business, there's a lot of big egos, but especially in the advertising business, I've noticed it to be a very ego driven business. And there's a lot of arrogant people that I had to deal with. And if there's one thing I hate, a characteristic, a personality trait in anyone that I really don't like, it's arrogance. So that's one of the things that I've tried to honor. It's been difficult because, again, I was really never good at kind of faking it and playing the game and figuring out how to create a facade just for self-advancement and really not being true to who I am, which is, I think, why I struggled in the corporate world as much as I did. So to answer your question, I would say, one of the things I stayed in sync with and in line with myself was my own integrity, which was easier when I was doing my own thing than when I was in the corporate world,
Very
as you see
nice.
from the stories I shared.
Yes, very nice. Were there any positive role models that helped inspire you along the way, other than your internal landscape of personal values?
Yeah, my dad by far was the biggest influence for me. He was a business owner.
And you're originally from Connecticut. Keep going.
Yeah. My family business was insurance, which to me was totally boring. If I felt differently about that, it would have been easy for me to go into the family business, but I was not interested in it. But my dad was a real straight shooter, and he was a very, very good. I was very fortunate in that he was successful, but he didn't compromise his values to try to make more money. He was very true to his feelings of integrity and was able to have a very successful business because of that. So that was by far the biggest role model I had. So I was very lucky in that respect.
Yeah, what a gift to have seen that modeled in front of you, knowing later on in life you were going to get tested.
Right.
Yeah, I also found it interesting in your life journey with your career. You just didn't start in Madison Avenue. You went to, I think it was like Atlanta and then Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and your first thoughts about New York City, even though you grew up kind of outside of it in Connecticut, was, oh my gosh, it's so loud and aggressive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you adapted, you
Yeah. Well, when New Yorkers think of Brent, which is like a suburb of New York, and it's very New Yorky part of Connecticut. I grew up more up the road from New York, and where I grew up, my neighborhood was very rural. So I had a very bucolic upbringing with grass and trees and flowers and stuff like that. So even though we were maybe less than 2 hour drive from New York City, it was a very different environment. So the times that we'd visit New York as a kid, it was like another planet. It was very aggressive and overwhelming and scary. And when I graduated Syracuse, unlike everyone who graduated with a degree in advertising, I did not want to go to New York City. I was just too intimidated. I just thought I'd be swallowed up and get my ass kicked. So I kind of worked my way up to it by starting out in Atlanta, because one of my mentors at Syracuse had worked in Atlanta and gave me some names of people if I wanted to fly down there and try to get a job, which is what I did. After 2 years in Atlanta, then I kind of took the next step up and went to Chicago for 3 years. And after 3 years in Chicago, I finally decided I was ready to give New York City a shot. I still thought I would get my ass kicked, but felt like I was a little bit more prepared having 5 years under my belt. And I was right. I did get my ass kicked, but I survived. So I spent the next 25 years working and living in New York City.
Very cool. And any final thoughts about the subject of legacy, and then how can viewers or listeners reach you?
Well, I think you said you were going to put a link to my video series in your show notes.
Yes.
So if you're not sitting at a computer or on your iPhone or something, you could Google True Stories in Advertising, and probably need to put my name, so some crappy stuff that's unrelated doesn't come up to that. So True Stories in Advertising with my name, John Follis, Follis, then it will come up. It's on YouTube. It's also on a platform called Vimeo. So either one of those will be where you can see it.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you, John, for creating the digital legacy that you have created in the time you've taken to define, develop, and execute your legacy plan, your vision, and also speaking into the experiences that went into that. It's never an easy road for anyone, and it's good to know the nuances that you survived each of those challenges, whether it was challenging the CEO or even, the obstacles when you had to deal with that one particular professor at Syracuse. Just to know that those individual moments aren't the end of the world, that they were, again, just testing your mettle, and you stuck to your values, your core values, as well as your integrity. So thank you for your time this lovely morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Angelina. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, wonderful. I'm just going to read out the closing paragraph. And so, in closing, I'm Angelina Carleton, the hostess of the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder of Legacy Planning, a boutique coaching and advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, but international in those I coach. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person define, develop, and execute their legacy, and continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources to every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners, there can never be enough education and preparation in the moat around your castle. Whether you find yourself with new wealth or generational wealth, may the content of this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your intellectual and emotional curiosity. So thank you so much for joining today. If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, John, as well.
Thank you, Angelina.